Hello, hello. And we are so thrilled to have Yvette Jackson with us. And we're going to have a lovely and lively conversation around equity and personalizing learning. So, Yvette, please introduce yourself to the Learning Personalized and Habits of Mind community.
Okay. Hi, I'm Yvette Jackson. I am so glad to be here with Benna and Allison, and I know we're going to take a wild journey today to, first of all, expand people's consciousness about equity, and also I hope to really address some myths regarding that as well, and so people could really look at practices that they're putting forward, like personal learning, and see how they really are so wonderful for this idea of building equity in a classroom.
So, Yvette, you've been reading and researching and writing and consulting and working on equity issues for a couple of decades or so?
Yes, that's very true. And that is true. Right, Ben, a couple of decades.
That's right. A couple of decades. That's right.
Saying a couple was kind.
So it's interesting to first lay down the framework of what are the equity concerns that potentially are as true right now as they were true a couple of decades ago.
Okay, well, the biggest concern is how children are perceived. When you're talking about equity, it should be starting from a place of moving on belief, that we have to have this belief that all students, regardless of where they are, what they look like, are born with innate potential for high levels of thinking, and to be able to use that thinking in a productive manner. Usually people don't associate that with equity. They're thinking more about looking at holding back certain kinds of prejudices, or looking at making sure there's instructional practices that include all races. But the idea is, if you really think about innate potential, then you have to say, in equity, what do we do to ensure? I don't know why I'm getting ready to cough right now. It must be my closet.
It's emotional. This is emotional.
I guess it is. But anyway, so yeah, water'd be great. My secretary.
Yeah, we have some. Would you like?
Oh, thank you. Better. Okay. See, if you had a 3D photocopier, we'd be able to get it. But anyway, the idea is that people are so much thinking about equity just in terms of looking at practices that hold kids back, as opposed to starting with the belief that all children can go much further when they have an enriched experience. And that's what we're trying to do with talking about equity from an equity consciousness, and give teachers the frame that says, am I putting forward in my class what I say the gifting of all children? And that's another thing that I'd like to put forward in terms of equity, because in terms of my work around the country, when I ask teachers or administrators, thank you, to really describe what does a classroom look like that's engaged in strong equity practices, they have such a hard time with the description. And yet, when I say, what does it look like when a class is engaged in gifted education, they can name, starting with student strengths. They talk about personalized learning. They talk about independent investigations that go with that personalized learning, et cetera, et cetera. And we're saying that's what equity is about. It's about putting forward those practices that are going to enable students to be able to show the highest level of potential. So those are the two biggest pieces that are never talked about, have never been talked about in terms of equity. I mean, the good thing over these decades is that at least people are even saying the word equity,
Right.
Because a couple of decades ago, that wasn't even a word that was part of the pedagogical lexicon. Now, at least it is, but it still enters the wrong door.
So one of the other interesting things, when I was on vacation last week, I had an opportunity to read your article a couple of times. And do we have permission to post that article as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. So other people can do the same reading that we're doing and thinking about. But one of the things is really thinking about equity in the achievement gap, and the notion of trying to close the gap. Potentially, as I continue to read and reflect on this, it's not asking the right question.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not trying to close the gap in achievement metrics that are not engaging anybody.
Right.
So
right.
I think that was something else that I really took away from the article, because you're really trying to, as I'm starting to play out the idea, when we're thinking about all students have innate potential, we're really, as classroom teachers, we're talent finders and
Right.
and curators and cultivators,
That's
as
right.
opposed to marching through a series of curricular experiences.
That's right. The other thing I want to say is, in the equity conscious world, we don't even talk about the achievement gap the same way, because right now the way people talk about the achievement gap, it is always gaps that are looked at across racial lines. And the more we look at it that way, it perpetuates this idea that children of color, oh, that's right, now we have to talk about equity, and now we're going to look at closing the achievement gap across races. And that's not what we talk about. We talk about the gap, meaning between a child's real innate ability and what they're achieving. So the gap should be an individual gap, meaning how do we close that gap that's between their potential, as I said, as opposed to comparing one child of one race with another child of a race. As I said, that perpetuates a myth about races. And that is why you have to be, in the world of equity consciousness, we're also conscious about language that we use, and we're conscious about what images and what concepts the wrong language can really render.
It seems to me that from everything that we've worked together on and what I know from what I see,
right,
what's interesting is that each and every one of us has a gap of one sort or another.
Absolutely.
So if there's anything that's equitable, it's that.
Exactly. That is so true. And that's why we go into the equity work by first talking about the gray color. Like, instead of talking about racial, we should be talking about gray matter. Because if you understand really the science behind learning, then, like you're saying, there are how you build on assets, but also understanding that everybody, first of all, is not great at everything, right? We understand that. And so the issue really becomes, well, how do we identify where that greatness is, where that potential is? And then where equity comes in also is, and what are the barriers? How do we talk a little bit more explicit about the barriers? But if you start with the premise that I just proposed, then you have to get to the barriers, because you have to say what really pushes assets forward and what holds them back for everybody, like you're saying.
So what we're also saying is that the modifier called achievement,
right,
when we talk about gap, makes an assumption that we also have a good, clean definition of achievement that we all agree upon.
Absolutely.
That's also something that I'm reading now about Finland and how they're talking about it. And, you think about it, the definition of success is just very different there.
Absolutely.
So, I think that we are so limited by the narrow lens in which we're looking at all of this. So I guess what I was interested in is talk a little bit about how you view personalized learning when you see it, like, out in the schools. What is it that you see that says to you, this is really a personalized experience?
The first thing is that the teacher has been engaged with the students in terms of identifying their strengths or their interests. That's number one. You can't really personalize if you haven't engaged in that first. And often it's interesting, in some cities and some schools, even the children have been held back so much that if you say, share with me what you think your strengths are, they can't identify them. They have been so framed in this negative perception that they can't. So that's why we say, okay, if we're not going to start with that as the idea, we're going to start by talking about what you're really interested in, because we know it's the interest that turns into passion, and the passion is what turns into strengths. So the first conversation is about, the interest and the passion. The next is, what is the teacher doing in the classroom to give a lot of exposure to students? Because sometimes students just haven't been exposed to what they're going to become passionate about. So it's not only, oh, we found something that you're really interested in, it's how do we continually offer this kind of window to enrichment, to watching how people build and construct and create and communicate meaning in so many different ways beyond just even the technology that we're talking about. You know, how do we get students exposed to what trends are existing right now that on a sociological level that in which they could start thinking that, that's interesting. I wonder what if, and they start pursuing that. So it's this constant enrichment. And so one of the things we tell teachers, especially in urban areas, when they say, well, you don't understand, we don't have resources. It's not like we can take these children on a lot of trips. We say, what about electronic field trips? It's incredible to me how many people are not aware of that particular vehicle that opens the eyes to possibilities for students. So again, with personalized learning, you're talking about what are the opportunities for students to even pursue the possibilities of interest. Then it is really sharing with students the kind of structures that enable them to do the independent research on whatever it is that they're calculating they're going to become interested in or already have a deep, profound interest in. But what are the different types of research they can use? How can they really critique media in a way that they understand that, especially now with the bots that are come through on through the technology and those kinds of things. So what I'm saying is, how do you not only share with students the way to do research, but how they're usually using research tools in a way that they can critique by looking at several different forms of information about a particular topic. And the last one is this idea of, okay, so now that you've done all of this, what are all the possibilities in terms of how you could really push through and demonstrate not only your thinking, but your productivity? And really, that's where the habits of mind become extremely important, because everything that I just listed, it's not only about exposure in terms of content or skill, it's how do students become galvanized in the kinds of dispositions they need to really push forward. And what we know is our kids have incredible dispositions when they are afforded the opportunity through the enrichment. They will pursue for hours and hours. They will persist. They will, all the rest.
Yeah. And it was so lovely, because I want to go back to a couple weeks ago when the three of us had a fabulous lunchtime conversation.
Right.
And I was talking about something that was happening in my own hometown, and the idea of a hidden curriculum, especially in relation to the experience we were having that day, listening to Tony Wagner and David Perkins. And to really talk about what's at stake when it comes to the idea of a hidden curriculum.
Yeah.
So can we sort of recreate that context a little bit together and explore that for a bit? Because this is the territory of really where habits of mind are so essential to be powerful, effective, and impactful in today's world.
Right. Well, I see that even when we use that terminology about hidden curriculum, there are really two ways to look at it. One, hidden curriculum, what are the kinds of things that we should be looking at developing more within a classroom that are either not thought about or are considered soft skills now, which to me, every time they say that, it makes me so crazy, because nothing is a soft skill. It's interesting when people connect emotions with soft, as opposed to there's so much cognition that is connected to emotion. How could you separate? So there's what should we be looking at more that is hidden in terms of what really pushes success forward. But the other, especially when you're talking about kids of color, is the hidden curriculum that really is very biasing and really keeps kids back. So instead of saying in those schools, we're really going to look at personalized learning and the highest kinds of achievement, what the hidden curriculum puts forward is we should be looking at literacy. That is our defining point, is how well can a child read, and they hold back everything else that happens to be the inspirational part of a curriculum. So that's also you might call that a hidden agenda, but it literally becomes part of a practice that becomes the curriculum. I was just in a school yesterday, and they were, some of the coaches were just telling me how the teachers were so following the script of their teacher's guide that when they were working with children, they did no real type of connecting to personal interest of students. They didn't start by looking at what kids already knew about a topic. I mean, you know, it's incredible. But that's a hidden curriculum to say, no, this is how you start and this is how far you go. So even something as simple as, you know, kids should learn these 10 words in a week. Why 10 words? That's ridiculous. But so anyway, I'm just going to put those two ideas forward, and then we can pursue that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of hidden curriculum may be what is explicit and what is not explicit.
Right.
So it's
right.
another way of thinking about it.
Exactly.
And I think that there's a lot of faulty assumptions that people have when they say, for example, well, I mean, I hear all the time, well, we don't really need to do the habits of mind. Kids know that. They know to persist.
Right.
So that then you think about which kids know that. Which kids have that language. And for some people, it's highly codified because of parental, cultural, whatever.
Right.
And for others, it's not acknowledged. And so it's not something that they know they need to be more skillful with.
Exactly.
And if you're told that you're not a good thinker, which I think kids begin to feel that assumption,
right,
then it's really hard to believe that you could be thinking flexibly or creating, imagining, and innovating, because you're constantly being reinforced with the idea that that's something that other kids know because it's not explicitly told to you.
Right.
So I think
that is so true.
I think the marriage has to be hidden curriculum and the assumptions that we have that keep it hidden.
Absolutely. You know what that also makes me think of? Right now, many people talk about Carol Dweck's work, right? And they'll talk about growth mindset. And even when they bring those ideas in the school, it's interesting because it stays theoretical, though. It isn't about application. What does it look like in a classroom besides telling kids you can really do better than this? You know, you really have this potential. So to me, personalized learning becomes an important vehicle for moving and reflecting and addressing a growth mindset, because kids come in with ideas about possibilities. They get to use them. They become persistent. They become just everything you were saying, flexible. They question, they push forward. That's a growth mindset. But I do not often hear those two things together.
So as I'm starting to connect the dots in our conversation, when I'm thinking about the header that everybody is going to be able to read this article on realizing the third element as that subheader, and starting to take on the idea that we have to start seeing every child, not just as a slogan on the wall or on a website, but actually have that as a mindset. How can I cultivate the talents of every single child in my classroom? So that to me is what you said originally when you started talking about starting to ask kids questions, having kids use one of the 4 attributes, having use their voice to understand themselves first. And part of that is identifying strengths. That's part of self-discovery. But also part of that is really starting to pay attention and step back and be reflective on, I haven't asked that question for a little bit. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And that's why you gave another alternative or a way around to start going after interest and then passion, and then you can use strength. But that's really dovetailing with the idea of a hidden curriculum that's transformed into an explicit curriculum that holds true to those habits of mind as one of the primary drivers of how we continue to grow students' thinking. but at the same time, we're leveraging content in that marriage.
Right.
So that to me is sort of thinking about where we started and where we're winding up now, how that's starting to connect. How does that resonate in the two of your minds?
Well, what it makes me think of, and Benna knew Reuven Feuerstein's work very, very much, and he was my teacher, and his whole point about cultivating the structural cognition of a child was really looking at this idea of mediation. What do you put forward that helps a child to reflect a lot on who or he or she is in the world, and then to make the connections between that and the intention of the teacher. And I bring that forward because, as you keep saying the explicit word, that is so important, because what he says is, first we have to identify what our intention is. So if our intention is what you were just saying, to cultivate and identify the giftedness in all children, once you identify that, though, you then have to say, well, then what should we be paying attention to? What is the attention? And one of the things that the habits of mind really offer is these dispositions to pay attention to, and then to be reflective on the part of the teacher and say, well, what are the practices I'm putting forward that enables me to pay attention to our children questioning? Are they using their voice that way? Are they being reflective? And if they are not, it's not the children. It is the curriculum and the opportunity, or not, that really is going to either hold back or move that explicit identification of dispositions that you're looking for.
So I think we also have to be really careful as we think about it, because here are some of the misunderstandings that I see. Mm-hmm. So one misunderstanding would be to say, well, I think that's true. So you know what we do? We have Genius Hour.
Yes.
And in Genius Hour, we make sure the kids have a chance to play, to come up with great ideas. And it's an hour.
That's once a week.
Make and take. And it's like,
like 43 minutes.
That's right. Yeah, give or take. Right.
And is it acknowledged as deep thinking? It's a question.
Right.
And then I think another question is one that says, well, we can find what kids need in terms of their interests. What we'll do is we'll put them on a playlist, and they'll see lots of different options. Like, oh, you said you were interested in cars. Here's 4 great websites where you can go look at cars. So what I'm suggesting is that the role of the teacher is critical in all of this, that Absolutely. It's not just how do we help kids to find their interests, their strengths, their talents by survey, by technology, by, nothing short of really working closely with the child is going to tell you how to turn the lights on in their eyes.
Right.
So
exactly.
I think that's, the part that I think we're missing when we think that it's just a matter of let's find their strengths.
Absolutely. Well, I think the other thing is that to me, pedagogy is the vehicle for equity, right? It's not just looking at 2 or 3 dimensions that we're talking about, but it's like you're saying, it's got to be pervasive in the entire pedagogical process, so that when we're really talking about this identification of strengths, it has to be, and how does this get perpetuated in everything that we're doing in the class, and what are the barriers that I have to make sure I'm paying attention to, or what is it that these children are missing that I have to make sure I'm adding to the process. So that's why I say pedagogy, because it's not just the content, and it's just not the science of learning, but it is that real art of being able to connect with the kids about moving them through their passion in such a way that they're continually being reflective and learning more even about themselves than about the content. And that's what I'm thinking that is the most important in equity consciousness, that the child can say after the process that they've gone through in personalized learning, you know what I really learned about myself? I learned that when I do X, Y, Z, I really am able to think about other things that are so important to me, or I'm able to see myself in a different way. Those kinds of important what can I say, the practices or ways that teachers are putting that kind of frame around it, so students are constantly reflecting and getting feedback and seeing more about who they are developing to be.
I mean, what you just said is not only something that clearly the three of us believe, but also the level of compassion and understanding and candor of how you framed not only just that last statement, but all the way through the interview. Because to continue to treat every child as someone that is worthy of spending time and attention on to grow their talents, as opposed to only seeing them through a deficit-based model where the finish line keeps getting further and further out of reach. And that's something that not just the students feel, but also the teachers feel.
Absolutely.
And trying to, that I think maybe that's how we'll end on that one last question of, so what do you say to teachers that say to you, I really want to make progress in this work? What's one or two things that you might suggest in their pushing to this conversation?
I have a very favorite poet whose name is David White, and he often talks about this idea of remembering and discovering. And to me, that's what this work is about. How do you remember yourself as a child in terms of wanting to be pushed to the frontier of your intelligence, want to be exposed, want to believe that others believe in you? How do you remember that and put that forward? And then how do you put forward the kinds of opportunities where you're constantly discovering these amazing, wonderful things about these children and about yourself as the teacher? Because the more we're getting this kind of positive feedback from the children, it becomes our own empirical research, where we can look back and say, wow, first of all, I did that really well as a teacher, and I can tell because look at how the students just responded. And the more we cultivate that kind of response from the students, the more confidence we give the teachers about why they even chose to go into this profession to begin with.
Beautiful, beautiful, Yvette. You are.
Oh, thank you. Well, I have good inspiration in front of me.
Thank you so much for joining us. That really is so wonderful. And we appreciate it. We appreciate
Thank you for the opportunity, and best of luck in all your work. And I can't wait to continue to work with you.